Welcome to the final part of Blackbird. Isn't this exciting? Today we're going to finish off the story. I've actually liked it a lot better than I remember so far, so this is cool. Let's just get right back into it. So Noel, our main character, had just come across a cop as he was shouting for his dead friend, who was dressed in a bird costume, to forgive him, who has been tormenting him for days. So as you can imagine, the cop asked him if he's drunk or high. Noel rolled his eyes and faced the guy. He had dark skin and closely cropped hair. An unimpressive badge was clipped to his belt. Neither, he said. I was having nightmares, so I went for a run. The campus cop shined his light from Noel's feet to the top of his head. Noel held his arms out away from his body, hands open to show he carried nothing. What's your name? The cop put the light back in Noel's eyes. Noel squinted and looked away, frowning at the spots that contorted his retinas. But hey, maybe if he was blind, he wouldn't be able to see the Blackbird. Even thinking the name made the imagery assert itself. Name? The cop repeated. Noel Markham. Could you please not shine that right in my eyes? The cop lowered the flashlight beam. Noel couldn't see the cop's face very well, but he didn't look much older than Noel himself. He was much taller than Noel, though, and the way he loomed over the scene reminded Noel of "Stop it," he commanded himself. Why were you yelling? The cop asked. I was trying to get something out of my system. The cop whipped the light back in Noel's eyes. Drugs? No, I'm not high. I'm not drunk. He hesitated. I did something to piss off a friend, and he's mad at me. I don't know. The campus cop lowered the flashlight again. For a few minutes they stood in silence. Noel noticed crickets chirping, which he hadn't heard when he was running. Then the campus cop surprised him. He said, I get that. You want to say you're sorry, but you're a little pissed that he's so pissed, so you're yelling that you're sorry to get that anger out of your system. Noel lifted an eyebrow. Not bad for a campus cop. That's exactly right, he said. Okay, well, do you think you're done yelling? Noel nodded. I can be, yes. Okay. Noel waited to be sure the guy was done with him. The cop gestured down the path with his flashlight. I suggest you keep running. It's a great way to get stuff out of your system. Yeah, thanks. They nodded at each other and Noel headed off again. By the time he'd run a mile, the barest hint of pale pink was touching the top of the hills at the east edge of town. Dawn was coming. And Noel hadn't really slept at all. Was he ever going to sleep again? He had to let Sam know he was sorry, some other way than by screaming in the middle of the campus. But how? Noel was running back to his frat house when he heard footfalls approaching from the left. Slowing, trying not to quake in fear, Noel glanced in the direction of the footfalls. He tried to tell himself it sounded like a person, not a bird. And he was right. Noel! For the first time in hours, Noel relaxed. He didn't relax completely, but he let go of every anxiety enough to unkink the muscles in his neck and shoulders. Hi, Amber. She jogged in place in front of him. Wearing dark blue sweats and a white t-shirt, she was just starting to work up a sheen of sweat. I've never seen you running in the morning before, Amber said. I don't run in the morning. Ah, so this must be one of your clones. Noel smiled, and when he realized how good it felt to smile, he smiled wider. Yes. How many do you have? As many as I need for all the things I don't do. Amber laughed. Do you want to run with me, Noel clone? Sure. Why not? Noel wasn't ready, not even a little, to face the day. He still hadn't come to terms with the night. When they finished running, they ended up at the cafeteria again. We have to stop meeting like this. Amber used the hem of her shirt to wipe the sweat off her face. I've never met you here before, he said. That was Noel's other clone. Right, I forgot. The cafeteria doors were just opening. An enticing bacon aroma wafted out through the double doors. Only a few bleary-eyed students were starting to straggle toward the building. Amber put her foot up on the railing alongside the stairs and bent over to stretch. Noel felt sweat trickling down his spine. He closed his eyes for a second and then immediately opened them wide to try and wake himself up. Then he wiped his eyes. They were dry and scratchy. Are you okay? Amber asked. I mean, seriously, you don't look too good. Well, thanks. Amber gave him a half smile. You know what I mean. Your eyes are really red. I haven't slept. All night? Noel shook his head. Anything I can do? Noel studied her. It was funny. Just now, he realized she reminded him a little of Christine, the girl he'd bullied in junior high. She had similar coloring, her mouth was the same shape. He wondered if that's why he'd never thought of her as pretty until recently. Amber had been in several of his classes, in both the previous year and this one, and he'd never given her a second glance until a couple of days before. Now, he realized he liked her a lot. With like came trust, so he blurted, How would you fix it if you did something really wrong and it was a long time ago, but then you did it again recently, and you can't apologize to the person you did it to, but you're sorry and you want to make amends somehow? Amber tilted her head and pursed her lips. Guilt is keeping you awake? Something like that. Amber sat on one of the concrete steps and patted the space next to her. Noel acknowledged a greeting from a friend and sat next to Ember. The concrete was cold and damp. It's nice that you feel guilt. It shows character. A lot of guys are too stupid to know when they should feel guilty. I might have thought you were one of those. So why do you want to go out with me? I might have thought I was wrong. Noel wasn't so sure she was. Did he feel guilty because he had character, or because he didn't want to be murdered by the Blackbird? I think guilt is like a weed. Amber lifted her face to the sun, which was starting to climb above the tops of the trees. It's best to pluck it out at the root. So apologize to the first person. The first person I need to apologize to, Noel said. But how does that make amends with the second person? Amber said it's an energy thing. Yin and yang balance the scales in one place and the balance radiates outward. Noel wasn't so sure about that, but he had to do something. There you are. Noel turned at the sound of a girl's voice. It was Darla in their friend group. She pointed at Amber and said, "You weren't where we always meet." Amber jumped up. "Sorry, it's his fault." She pointed at Noel and grinned. He stood too. "I need a shower." Amber nodded and headed toward her friends. She turned back. "Good luck." "Thanks." He knew he was going to need it. How in the world was he going to find Christine Wilbur? But first, this video is sponsored by the Elementia Studios Discord. On there, you can chat with other FNAF fans and just fans of the channel. You can showcase your fan art, you can discuss your theories, you can just hang out with cool people. It's fun, you'll like it. So the link will be in the description, so you can check it out if you want to. That's about it. How in the world was he going to find Christine Wilbur? Noel contemplated this question during his much-needed shower, and when he got back in his room, and when he stood at his window, watching people head to class, he'd already decided he was skipping all his classes for the day. Now he grabbed his laptop and prepared to find Christine. Looking at his bed longingly, Noel took his laptop to his desk. He was afraid if he even sat in bed, he'd start to fall asleep. A quick internet search hadn't helped. Christine Wilbur wasn't coming up on any searches, she apparently didn't do social media, and she hadn't done anything significant enough to get her on a search engine's radar. So how could he find her? Oh great, Noel is stalking some random girl. That's fantastic. A couple of Noel's frat brothers had been talking about Sam when Noel had returned to the frat house. Sam was still missing. So finding Christine was the only way for him to be safe again. Or was he just coming unhinged? What if the previous night had only been some simple sleep disorder caused by the shock of the day's news? He no longer felt like he was in shock, or maybe if he tried to sleep now he'd be okay. He hadn't seen any dark shadows or glimpses of big birds on his way back to the frat house. That was a good sign, wasn't it? Noel closed his eyes just briefly, and felt like he could fall asleep sitting up. Okay, that was it. He was going to lie down and go to sleep and forget all about Christine Wilbur and Sam and the Blackbird. Since the only injuries he'd sustained in the harrowing hours of the long night were ones he'd caused himself, he had to conclude that the threat was in his head. And if it was in his head, he could darn well beat it. Resolved, he set aside his laptop and got into bed, fully dressed in jeans and a white t-shirt. He sighed, stretching out. He put his head in the pillow, closed his eyes, and sleep took him right into hell. The second Noel's brainwaves slowed, the Blackbird appeared in a dissonant din of keening and buzzing that was so intense it felt like a physical invasion boring into Noel's ear canal. Diabolical wings leaned over Noel menacingly. Aiming its beak directly at Noel's right eye, the Blackbird bent even closer. Noel knew his eye was closed because he was asleep, but in the dream world, his eyes were open to see the beak moving lower and lower. At the same time, the weight ramming down on him got heavier and heavier. Noel's chest was being crushed under the feathered mass. Even though he knew it would do no good, Noel wriggled and jerked himself back and forth, trying to throw off the hideous creature. He concentrated on trying to free his legs, but that just made things worse. His legs started to spasm, and it felt like someone was trying to tear them off his body. The pain in his limbs was excruciating. The sound morphed, too. The high-pitched tones abated, only to be replaced with a combination of crackling static and a loud hum, interrupted at regular intervals by a deafening zap sound that reminded Noel of the electric bug zappers his grandfather kept by his back deck, only this zap was not designed for mosquitoes. It was tuned to something the size of a pterodactyl. This is such a weird description of the Blackbird. Where are these sounds coming from? I'm very confused, but I like it. Noel realized that he could no longer breathe. The weight on his chest was flattening his lungs and stopping his heart. He felt like he was being dragged into some other realm, the Blackbird's realm, and as he left this world, the world he knew, the world he realized he'd taken for granted all his life, his body began to tingle. The tingles sped up, and they became vibrations so fast and powerful, it felt like every cell in his body was palpitating at a jackhammer pace. Faster and faster his body vibrated, and it began to emit a droning sound. Noel tried to scream, but he couldn't even use his mouth. He realized he couldn't even feel his mouth, or the rest of his body. He wasn't just paralyzed, he was numb. All that was left of Noel was his consciousness. His mind was still functioning fine. In fact, it was functioning too well. It was giving him a relentless rundown on the system-wide failure of his body. Noel's existence receded further and further into an inky, feathered oblivion. The noise crescendoed. The pain intensified. Noel was sure he was on the verge of total annihilation. And then, it all stopped. Except for a vice grip on his arm, an annoying jostling of his shoulder, and the sound of someone yelling, "Dude!" Noel opened his eyes. Ian let go of his arm and shoulder and backed away from the bed. "Dude," he repeated, but at a lower volume. Noel realized he was bathed in sweat. His skin felt clammy and his clothes stuck to him. He ached all over. "Are you okay?" Ian asked. Noel couldn't answer that question, so he just shook his head and then nodded. That should clear things up. Ian, wearing only red boxer shorts covered with charging bowls, dropped onto Noel's desk chair. Noel looked at him. He'd never seen the big guy look so shook up. He'd never seen Ian in his room before, either. They only hung out when other frat brothers were around, usually in the main lounge downstairs. "How'd you get in here?" Noel asked. Ian blinked, then twisted his mouth in a guilty little kid way. "Oh, I sort of broke your door." Noel looked over to see his door jamb splintered and his door hanging on one hinge. "Sorry," Ian said. I thought you were dying." Noel returned his gaze to Ian and raised an eyebrow. "I've never heard anyone make a sound like that, dude," Ian said. "It was loud, but really low, like grunting, sort of. Like you were trying like crazy to scream, but someone had their hand over your mouth. And there were all these thuds and thumps. I thought someone was trying to kill you. So I broke the door to get in." Tears filled Noel's eyes. He was weirdly touched. Then fizzes of terror skirted along his skin. What if he had been dying? What would have happened if Ian hadn't busted in his room to wake him? Would the Blackbird have been able to take Noel to another, dimension, realm, level of hell? He realized Ian was waiting for him to say something. "Thanks, Ian. I was stuck in a really nasty nightmare. You got me out of it." Ian shrugged. "Well, good. It seemed pretty bad." He looked hard at Noel. "Are you sure you're okay?" Noel nodded. "Nothing a hot shower and some food won't solve." He sat up. He tried to ignore the room-spinning sensation that triggered a wave of nausea. Ian stood. "Okay. Well..." Noel wasn't sure he could stand yet, so he didn't. "Sorry about your door," Ian said. I can fix it for you." He strode to the door and looked at it. "I just need to get a couple things from the hardware store." "You don't need to do that. It's my fault you broke it." Ian shook his head. "No, I want to. I like fixing things. It'll take my mind off the makeup test I have later today. I need to pass it so I can keep playing ball." Noel nodded. "Let me know if you ever need any help with classwork." Ian looked closely at him, probably to see if Noel was jerking his chain. He wasn't. He might have been the day before, giving the dumb jock a hard time, but not today. Ian nodded. "Thanks." He went through the now unguarded opening to Noel's domain. Ian?" Noel called. "Yeah?" Ian turned. "If you had to find someone from your past, like from junior high or something, what would you do? I mean, if they weren't online." "I don't know. Do you know their parents?" Noel snapped his fingers. "That's brilliant. Yes, thanks. Great. Thanks again, Ian, for breaking in." Ian shrugged. "Anytime." "I hope not," Noel muttered when Ian went back to his own room. Noel stood, and for the second time that day, he headed for the showers. In the shower, he chastised himself for being so dense. He knew Christine Wilbur's parents were still in town because her dad owned Wilbur's Eats, a popular greasy spoon diner downtown. How could Noel have forgotten that? Maybe so the story could have been a bit longer. Just one. Maybe that's it. One of the things he'd often said to Christine when he was bullying her was, "So you've eaten everything on your dad's menu 1,000 times. What do you recommend?" Noel groaned at the memory and turned the water to cold. He flinched when the icy bite shocked his skin. But he both needed and deserved the jolt. It would help him do what he needed to do. Noel was relieved to find Wilbur's Eats mostly empty when he arrived. Only one silver vinyl booth was taken, by an elderly couple picking through scrambled eggs and hash browns, and only one red vinyl stool was occupied, by a sleepy-looking guy in a janitor's uniform. He was drinking coffee and methodically plowing through a large piece of cherry pie. The diner smelled like a diner, a good one. The aromas came from the food, a weird but not unpleasant mix of onions, fried chicken, apples, and chocolate, and the coffee not from Greece. Clunking and sizzling sounds came from behind a low divider wall separating the dining room from the kitchen. There was a large pass-through for the food, and next to it hung one of those carousel things to clip orders to. It was empty. A thin woman with limp, dyed blonde hair turned to greet Noel when he entered. "Sit wherever you want." She waved a hand and returned to her chore, starting a new pot of coffee. The woman wore a pinkish uniform dress and a bright blue apron. Her name tag read Lois. Noel didn't want to sit. He wanted to get on with it. So he approached the counter near an old-fashioned cash register. He shifted from one foot to the other. Lois turned and raised an eyebrow. "Did you want takeout?" "No, thank you. I need to see Mr. Wilbur. Is he here now?" Lois chuckled. "Sure he is. He practically lives here now. He does all the cooking." Lois rotated toward the kitchen and yelled, "Earl, get out here. Someone's asking for you." Noel clenched his fists. He was not looking forward to this conversation. Understandably. He looked up and watched a very short man push through a swinging door to the right of the food pass-through. No wonder Noel hadn't gotten a glimpse of the man. He was barely 5 feet tall, and he was thin. That was a surprise. "Hello, sir," Noel held out his hand. "My name's Noel Markham." Earl Wilbur grinned and shook Noel's hand. "Good to meet you." Earl was missing a front tooth, but somehow that added to his friendly smile. Unlike his fair-haired daughter, Earl had brown hair and brown eyes. But Noel could see Christine in the man's face. Or would that be the other way around? Both had bow-shaped mouths, wide cheekbones, and close-set eyes. "What can I do for you?" Earl Wilbur asked. His manner was deferential. Noel had been trying to think of a smooth way to bring up the subject of finding Christine, and he hadn't come up with a thing, so he just burst out with it. "Sir, I need to find your daughter Christine, and I was hoping you could tell me where she is." Earl Wilbur's friendly expression didn't change. He just said, "That right?" He leaned an elbow on the counter across from Noel. Noel noticed Earl Wilbur's forearm was cross-hatched with little burn scars. "From short-order cooking?" "And why's that?" Earl asked. "You sweet on her?" Lois asked. Her voice was low and scratchy. Earl laughed and patted her shoulder. "Well now, Lois, I expect that's his business." Outside, the sun disappeared so abruptly everyone in the diner turned to look through the picture window. Black storm clouds were tumbling across the sky. Beneath the clouds, right outside the diner, a huge hunched and feathered form shuffled past. What? Noel did a double take. Had he just seen that, or had he imagined it? He looked around to check if anyone else had seen it. The elderly woman in the booth was looking past the elderly man's shoulder, her gaze focused on the clouds, and her face pinched in what could have been fear or worry. But maybe she just didn't like storms. Whether he saw it or made it up, Noel had a feeling he needed to get a move on. Looking back at Christine's dad, Noel said, "I'm going to tell you the truth, even though it makes me look, really bad." But he shrugged. "I was in junior high with Christine, and I was a bully. I wasn't nice to her at all, and I need to tell her how sorry I am that I was, mean to her." "Is this one of those make amends things?" Lois asked Noel. "Not in any official way. I just needed her to know I'm sorry." Earl Wilbur rubbed his jaw. "You the boy who threw burrs at her?" Noel scrunched up his face in pure embarrassment. He looked down. "Yeah, that was me." When Earl Wilbur didn't say anything, Noel looked up at the man. He expected to see anger in the man's eyes, but all he saw was compassion. Earl Wilbur held his gaze for several seconds. Noel squirmed, but he didn't break off the connection. He had to face what he'd done. What better way than looking his victim's father in the eye? Finally, Earl Wilbur said, "Okay, I'll tell you where she is." "She's such a sweet girl," Lois said. Noel ignored his sudden nausea and accepted the directions Earl Wilbur gave him. Then he went outside, making sure he didn't look up as he hurried to his car. Noel's car wasn't much of a car. Truthfully, it was basically a piece of junk on wheels. It was such a piece of junk, in fact, that Noel never admitted he ever owned the car. He kept it at his grandfather's house, and he only drove it when necessary. When the car was built, many, many years before, it had been a cool car. But too many owners, too many miles, too many fender benders, and just plain too much time had turned the car into a barely hanging together collection of rusted red metal and engine parts that only just managed, most of the time, to get Noel where he needed to go. Today, he was going to be pushing it. He only had to go about 35 miles, but the small campus where Christine was a sophomore, like Noel, was up in the mountains. The school was a music and arts college, according to Christine's dad. The storm clouds were still hanging around, and they made Noel very, very nervous. Whenever he accidentally glanced up at the sky, he saw feathered wings beating the billowed clouds. He also kept seeing an immense black feathered shape shambling along in the wake of his straining vehicle. Every time that happened, he pushed the accelerator pedal harder, which didn't help at all because he already had it pressed to the floor. Noel's car was struggling, predictably, with the uphill drive. After about 50 minutes, however, Noel arrived at a fancy modern cement archway over a narrow road that led into a small collection of glass and cement sculptural sculptures that nearly sang out artsy. As Earl Wilbur had instructed, Noel followed the road to the left as it wove through two inverted triangle-shaped buildings and took Noel right into the parking lot of an asymmetrical 4-story dorm. As soon as Noel turned off his car, thunder rumbled in the not nearly far enough away distance. A big drop of water hit Noel's arm as he got out of the car. Refusing to look around, he trotted towards the dorm, but even without seeing his oppressor, he knew it was there. He could hear the laborious lugging of feathers across the pavement, and he could feel the air currents behind him and around him shift as his hunter closed in. Noel was sweating by the time he got inside the dorm. The nausea that had started in the diner had grown and been joined by a pounding headache. Now Noel was starting to feel lightheaded. He had to hurry. Practically running through a sprawling lounge, his shoulder blades tingling with the sensation of being tracked, Noel glanced at a few girls sprawled on plush sectional sofas, chattering away. Oddly, he realized as he put the lounge behind him that he had no idea what the girls looked like or what they were wearing. He felt like his eyesight was getting blurry. The building smelled like cloves, and it was remarkably quiet for a dorm. Only the faintest hint of a staccato beat could be heard from a distance. It was a little after 5 p.m., and Earl Wilbur had told Noel that Christine was nearly always in her dorm at that time of the day because she ate early before going to practice. Earl didn't say what kind of practice. Noel easily found the room number Earl had given him, leaning against the wall to steady himself. Noel raised a hand and knocked. "Come in," a cheerful musical voice called. It sounded a little like Christine, but it was too upbeat to be her. Noel opened the door, looked around the room, and froze, staring. The room had only one person in it, a girl, and the girl was obviously Christine. He might have doubted that if he hadn't just been with Earl Wilbur, but this girl had her dad's features, if not his coloring. Christine was still as blonde and freckled as she'd been in junior high school. She still had the slightly crooked teeth, he remembered, but otherwise she was a completely different Christine Wilbur. "Hi, are you looking for Claire?" "Huh? My roommate?" Noel shook his head. He was having trouble staying upright. His legs felt weak, like something pushed against his back and down his shoulders as if trying to pile drive him into the floor. "Then who are you looking for?" Christine asked. She twisted her nose in the twitchy way she did when they were in junior high, but she didn't seem to see anything behind Noel. He tried to tell himself for the 100th time that he was imagining things. When Noel didn't answer, Christine said, "I think you have the wrong room?" She tilted her head with her sentence/question. Christine sat at a school desk similar to Noel's. She had a book open in front of her, and she held a plastic container of salad. It was nearly empty. When Noel didn't answer Christine, she looked down and forked up a cucumber. She bit into the cucumber, and its distinctive scent filled the air. So did her crunching sounds. Noel kept staring. Christine Wilbur sat cross-legged on her desk chair, and one of her bare feet kept time with the music that must have been in her head. She wasn't wearing earbuds. She was dressed in a full-length, skin-tight light blue leotard. Christine Wilbur wasn't overweight anymore. She was obviously as fit as Noel was. That wasn't the only way she was different. Although she still had the same facial features and quirky expressions, Christine held herself with an air of confidence that made it clear she was a very different girl from the one he'd known in junior high. Noel's mental processors were struggling to keep up with the unexpected information. His neural pathways were announcing, "This input does not compute." "Do you talk?" Christine asked. She hesitated and worked her mouth as if trying to find the right words. Then she said, "I'm not being mean or anything. It's just that you're standing there staring." She clasped her hands together and shrugged. Noel shook his head to try to reset his circuits. "You don't remember me?" he asked. "That's the first thing you say?" Christine laughed. Noel remembered that laugh. He'd only heard it once in junior high when he'd watched her play with a ferret someone had brought to show and tell. Her laugh was a pleasing trill that made you want to laugh too. She set down her salad. "Okay, let's see." She stared at him, then shook her head. "No, I don't remember you. Should I?" "I would." "You would what?" "I'd remember me, if I were you, I mean." Noel pressed his hand to his forehead. Christine shrugged again. Why don't you just tell me who you are? Noel blew out air. Okay. A couple other girls came down the hall behind Noel. They were singing at the top of their lungs. He waited until they were well past, trying to ignore the fact that they'd been followed by that swishing, thumping sound that told him his feathered nemesis was nearby. He opened his mouth, and he found he couldn't get the words out. His eyes filled with tears, and he had to swallow. Christine frowned. Hey, are you okay? Noel's eyes got even wetter. She was so nice. I was the guy who bullied you in junior high, he said. He said the words fast, sort of like peeling off a gilt bandage. Which one? Christine asked. Noel blinked. She shrugged and twisted her nose. The hate on Christine crew was pretty big. And yet her dad knew which one he was, like right away. The one who threw burrs at her, which apparently was only Noel. I don't know. Okay, cool, whatever, I don't care. I'm reading too much into this, and I know that. Sorry. I started the shh thing, and I threw burrs at you. Noel felt like he was about an inch tall. He couldn't understand why he'd ever thought it was so funny, either when he did it, or when he told Sam about it. Oh, that was you. She focused her small blue eyes on him. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Noel Markham. She nodded. I think I remember you. You didn't have all that hair then. You were skinnier, too. No muscle. Noel blushed. He had been pretty slight in junior high. What had made him think he was so great he could make fun of someone else? He wiped his still wet eyes. Christine stood and skipped across the room toward him so quickly it was like she flew. She was extraordinarily elegant and precise in her movement. Noel stiffened, not sure what she was going to do. She hugged him. This wasn't at all how he thought this was going to go. At first, Noel just stood there, his arms rigid at his side. But then the combination of her sincere kindness and the honey-sweet scent of her hair released him from his resistance. He hugged her back, blinking away his tears. Christine let him go and stepped away. She was so close he could see all the freckles and a few dark flecks in her blue eyes. That wasn't an I forgive you hug, she said. It was a thank you. What? Christine motioned for him to come into the room, and he did, sitting on her roommate's desk chair when Christine pulled it out. She returned to her desk, sat, and rotated her chair to face Noel. Clasping her hands together, she said, I'm not going to tell you this to let you off the hook for bullying, but it looks like you really are sorry. I really am, Noel said sincerely. He was surprised by how truly sorry he was. She nodded, though, for a few seconds, then said haltingly, I'm going to tell you this because I learned something from it, and I figure maybe I can pass it on. In junior high, my mom was always on my case about everything. I felt like crap about myself. You and the others kept putting me down, which also didn't help. To be honest, I barely remember you. But I remember how bad I felt all the time. Eventually, though, I stopped feeling bad, and I got angry. I decided to treat myself well. I liked to dance, and I started dancing to have fun, just alone in my bedroom. But then I started going to a real studio, and I found out that I'm actually pretty good at it. When the music swept me up, nothing else mattered. Of course, my mom loved the dancing, helped me lose weight, but that wasn't enough to make her happy. I think part of me will always struggle on some level with that. Noel stood, opened his mouth to protest. She came over and waved him off. Don't, it's okay. See, that's the thing. All that bullying forced me to step up and love myself. No matter what I see in the mirror or what people say about me, I know my value. I'm actually here on a dance scholarship. So see, sometimes when something bad happens, it really does lead to something good. Noel nodded. Christine looked right directly at him. And I do forgive you. You can let it go. I'm fine. Noel's eyes teared up again, and he wiped them with the back of his hand again. Christine looked over Noel's shoulder. She patted and squeezed his hand. And then he walked out into the hallway, and she closed her door. Noel sagged against the wall. That's when he realized he no longer felt a presence lingering nearby. No more feathers. The hallway was silent. His headache was gone. Noel rolled his head from side to side and shrugged, then released his shoulders. His tension was gone, too. It was all gone. He felt like he'd just set down a backpack full of bricks. Noel smiled a little and picked his way through the dorm. In the lounge, he waved at the girls. He could see them clearly now. They were dressed in leotards like Christine's. Outside, Noel wasn't surprised to find the sun plowing its way through the clouds. He closed his eyes and breathed in the air, scented by the miniature carnations growing in a planter at the edge of the parking area. He hadn't noticed those on the way in. He started toward his car, and his phone rang. Reaching in his pocket, Noel picked out his phone and answered it. Hello? The first two words spoken into his ear brought Noel to a stop. As he listened, he started grinning. Then he said, I'm on my way." He ran for his car. Sam was waiting for Noel in front of the film studies building when Noel got back. "Sam!" Noel shouted. He ran toward his friend. Sam raised a crutch and waved it in the air, then put it back down when Noel reached him. Noel grabbed Sam and hugged him. As best he could, Sam hugged him back enthusiastically. "There's my favorite idiot," Sam said. "Where were you? You didn't say." "I went—" Noel waved the air. "It doesn't matter. What happened to you?" Sam rolled his eyes. "Apparently I've been hanging around you too long. Idiocy must be catching." Noel smacked Sam's shoulder. "Ow, hey, wounded guy here." Sam winked. "Seriously, I was being dumb. I was walking on the tracks with headphones on." "Dumb is one word for it." Sam laughed. "Yeah, right? So I turned around just in time to see the train, and I jumped off the tracks, but jumping has never been something I'm good at, so not only did something on the train gouge my arm as I leaped," he lifted a bandaged arm, "I lost my balance and fell down the embankment and broke my leg. If I'd had normal-sized legs, I probably would have been fine." Noel laughed. "You and your legs, get over it." Sam ignored Noel. "I was trying to drag myself back up when I slipped and ended up sliding all the way down to the culvert. Then I passed out. I guess I was pretty well hidden. I never heard anyone calling for me, and no one saw me until early this morning, when my parents came back with a couple cops to search again." Sam punched Noel's arm. "I'm so happy to see you, man." "Not as happy as I am to see you." Noel realized he meant that. Really meant it. "And I'm sorry." He wasn't taking any chances. Just because Sam was here didn't mean the Blackbird was gone. For what? For being such a jackass about the bullying thing. You're right. It's not funny. Sam waved the air with his crutch again. "I was oversensitive about it. It's no big deal." "No," Noel said, "being thoughtless is a big deal." Sam shook his head. "I won't disagree with that, but I shouldn't have thrown stones at a glass house." "Huh?" "I never answered you when you asked if I had secrets." Noel waited. Sam leaned in. "Remember I said I was bullied?" Noel nodded. "Well, I got revenge on one of my bullies by bullying him right back. I played a really mean joke on him just before freshman year." "Jerk." Sam laughed. "Back at ya." "Nah," Noel said. "No more jerk clones." "What?" Noel laughed. "Oh, it's a joke between Amber and me." "Amber and me, huh? I want to hear about that. Want to grab a pizza?" "Sure, I'm starving. I haven't eaten since before noon." "Why not?" "Long story. Maybe I'll tell you sometime." "The Blackbird will make you tell," Sam said. Noel's heart stuttered, but then Sam laughed. The end. What a magical story. Wish he actually mentioned what the prank was that or the joke was that he played on one of his bullies. Kind of doesn't mention it, but whatever. I'll tell you one thing. I feel like I've been kind of pointing out the things that I don't think make sense throughout this whole story, because that's what I do, because I'm a huge pessimist. But I really like the story, actually. Benefit of hindsight says I like this a lot more than I did on my first reading. I think it actually stands out a lot better than 1:35 a.m. I think that mainly because of the moral. The moral is what really makes this stand out, the whole thing of guilt. And it has a really wholesome ending and stuff. And I think the moral is a really good one, to learn from. And it's actually pretty scary. I think the imagery of those wet feathers kind of like dragging against the ground is pretty creepy. And while, it's never really described whether the threat is real or not, I like that ambiguity. I kind of like it. It's still very similar to 1:35 a.m., and I still believe that. Probably could have afforded to be a bit more unique, but I didn't mind it. I think it's a good story. And I don't know. We haven't really gotten any like this since then, of that, like, whole villain in the protagonist's head type of thing. So if this is the last one we're getting, at least for a while, I'm fine with that. Because it's a good story. Next time, we'll be reading The Real Jake. Thank you for listening. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you guys soon. I have something else, also, not an audiobook that I'm planning. I'm not just going to keep doing these audiobooks. I'm going to do other videos in between, obviously. Kind of space things out a bit. But yeah, see you then. Bye-bye.